He fired a single mom for requesting 1 day off in 7 years, then froze when he saw her dining with his billionaire mother. Jackson Williams is the kind of man who believes rules matter more than reasons. At 44, he runs his company with surgical precision, no exceptions, no emotional allowances. He grew up surrounded by privilege, but built his career on ruthless standards. To him, fairness means everyone is treated the same, no matter what they're carrying outside the office. Helena Brooks lives on the other side of that equation. At 35, she spent 7 years proving she belongs. Never late, never absent, never asking for grace. As a Black single mother, her days begin before sunrise and end long after her son is asleep. Every sacrifice she makes is quiet. Every promise she makes to her child is loud in her heart. Between them stands a conflict that goes beyond policy. The difference between rigid fairness and human dignity. It didn't begin at the gala. It began in a glass-walled boardroom where results were worshipped, exceptions were treated like weakness, and one decision, made in the name of standards, set a chain of consequences in motion that no policy could contain. The boardroom of Williams Dynamics didn't just hold meetings, it enforced belief systems. Glass walls framed the city like a living spreadsheet, grids of windows, lines of traffic, blinking lights that pulsed with the rhythm of money moving. Inside, the air hummed with a silence so tight it felt engineered. 12 executives sat around the obsidian conference table, their tablets glowing with projections, charts, and trend lines. No one spoke unless spoken to. At the head of the table, Jackson Williams stood, jacket buttoned, sleeves immaculate, posture precise. His voice was calm, not loud, not rushed, calm in the way a scalpel is calm before it cuts. The churn rate in the logistics division climbed 2.4% this quarter, he said, tapping the screen. The numbers magnified behind him, a red line arcing upward. That's not noise. That's a signal. A murmur shifted through the room, controlled discomfort. The head of operations cleared his throat. We've had some staffing instability, sir. 2 maternity leaves, 1 long-term illness. It created coverage gaps. Jackson lifted a hand. The room stilled instantly. Instability is not an explanation, he said. It's a symptom. Our systems exist to absorb human variability. If your division can't function when people are absent, your systems are broken. He let the silence work. This company doesn't bend for circumstances. Circumstances bend to structure. We don't reward inconsistency. We remove it. No one argued. They never did. Jackson's eyes moved around the table, cataloging micro-reactions, tightened jaws, straightened spines, averted gazes. He didn't enjoy fear. He enjoyed clarity. And fear, when calibrated correctly, produced results. Effective immediately, he continued. We're implementing a revised attendance metric. Any deviation from scheduled availability without executive clearance will impact performance reviews. No exceptions. The words landed with finality. The meeting ended the way it always did, abruptly, efficiently. Chairs slid back. Tablets dimmed. Executives filtered out with rehearsed neutrality, already recalculating how to translate policy into pressure. Jackson remained behind. He walked to the glass wall and looked down at the city he believed he understood. His reflection stared back, tailored suit, sharp jawline, eyes that learned early never to ask for permission. He had grown up surrounded by wealth, but never softness. His mother, Margaret Williams, had built an empire from a modest inheritance and an iron-willed refusal to be underestimated. Compassion, she had taught him, was something you practiced after success, not before it. Fairness meant consistency. Consistency meant strength. Strength meant survival. He checked his watch. The gala would begin in a few hours. Another room. Another performance. Another set of expectations he would meet without flinching. Across the city, Helena Brooks was already awake. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the kitchen light glowed warm against the dimness. She moved quietly, careful not to wake her son as she packed his lunch. Cut apples arranged into a small smile, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a folded note tucked between napkin and container. You've got this today. Proud of you always. 7 years of mornings like this had trained her hands to move without noise. She checked the clock. 5:47 a.m. Mom? A sleepy voice called from the hallway. Helena turned, her heart lifting. Hey, champ. Malik stood there rubbing his eyes, hair twisted into unruly spirals. He was 10 now, too old to be carried, too young to pretend he didn't still want to be. She knelt and smoothed his curls. You ready for your big day? His eyes brightened instantly. You're coming, right? The question carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She forced a smile. I'm trying, baby. Trying. The word felt like a promise she wasn't sure she was allowed to make. At work, Helena was known as the reliable one. The closer. The one managers trusted to stay late, pick up shifts, deliver results without complaint. 7 years without a single unplanned absence. 7 years of saying yes when it cost her something. She didn't advertise her life. She believed professionalism meant not asking for grace. But Malik's award ceremony wasn't just another event. It was the first time his teacher had called him exceptional in front of the whole school. He had rehearsed his short speech in the mirror, shoulders back, voice steady. He had told his classmates his mom would be there. Helena swallowed the familiar fear. At 8:03 a.m., she sat at her desk and stared at the blank email window. The request had been drafted and deleted 3 times. Each version sounded like weakness to her own ears. She opened the attendance log on her screen. 7 uninterrupted years of green check marks. She attached the coverage plan she'd arranged with 2 coworkers. She listed the deliverables she would complete ahead of time. Then she wrote one sentence she couldn't polish into something less human. I'm requesting one day to attend my son's school award ceremony. Her finger hovered over send. She closed her eyes and clicked. By noon, Jackson's assistant had forwarded the request to his queue. He read it once. Then again. 7 years. One day. He noted the attachments, the coverage plan, the pre-completed tasks. He acknowledged the discipline behind the ask. He did not acknowledge the ask itself. Policy was policy. He typed a brief response requesting Helena to come to his office at 2 p.m. Helena arrived early. She stood outside the door, palms pressed flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking. The hallway smelled faintly of polish and recycled air. She straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and knocked. Come in, Jackson said. She stepped into the office that decided outcomes. The city glowed behind him, framed by glass. He didn't invite her to sit. Ms. Brooks, he said. Your request. She nodded. Yes, sir. I reviewed your record, he continued. Impressive consistency. Relief flickered across her face. She let herself hope for half a second. Consistency is why this is disappointing, he said. Exceptions undermine standards. Her breath caught. Sir, I've arranged coverage. My work will be completed ahead of schedule. This is a single afternoon. This company doesn't function on personal calendars, Jackson replied. We function on reliability. She held his gaze. I have been reliable. For 7 years. And today, he said evenly, you're asking us to bend. Silence stretched between them. Helena thought of Malik in his mirror, practicing his speech. She thought of the folded note in his lunch. She thought of all the days she had missed that didn't come with applause. I'm asking you to see me, she said quietly. Not just my output. Jackson's expression didn't change. That's not how leadership works. She nodded once. The decision settled in her bones. Then I won't be here this afternoon. Jackson's eyes sharpened. If you leave, you're choosing not to meet your obligations. I'm choosing my son. The words surprised even her with their steadiness. Jackson turned to his screen. Typed. Signed. Your position will be terminated effective immediately, he said. HR will handle your exit. The office returned to its hum. Helena stood there for a heartbeat longer than she needed to. Then she turned and walked out into the daylight, unemployed, but unbroken. Helena didn't cry when the elevator doors closed behind her. The mirrored walls caught her reflection. Chin lifted, shoulders squared, eyes steady. She watched the numbers descend as if they were just another set of metrics to survive. Floors blurred past. Conversations from the hallway faded into the mechanical sigh of cables and gears. Somewhere above her, a life she had built with discipline and silence had ended. Somewhere ahead of her, Malik would be waiting for news that would change the shape of their world. The doors opened. The lobby's glass swallowed the afternoon light. Helena stepped into the day and kept walking. It wasn't bravery that carried her forward. It was habit. 7 years earlier, Helena had stood in this same lobby with a manila folder pressed to her chest and a promise lodged in her throat. Malik had been 3 then, small enough to fall asleep on her shoulder while she practiced interview answers in the bathroom mirror. She remembered the way the security desk looked at her stroller like it was a problem she'd need to solve before anyone else did. She solved it. She learned quickly how to be invisible and exceptional at the same time. The first promotion came with a smile and a title that didn't quite match the workload. She took it anyway. The second never came, though she trained the person who received it. When she asked what she could do better, her manager said, "You're solid, Helena. Just keep doing what you're doing." Solid was a word that didn't move. She stayed late when the office emptied. She covered shifts when coworkers begged, and she said yes even when Malik's backpack sat waiting by the door for a trip that would be postponed. She learned to read emails by the blue light of her phone while stirring soup with one hand. She learned to smile when her name wasn't called. Reliability became her reputation. Reliability became her armor. There were nights she tucked Malik into bed after he'd already fallen asleep on the couch, cartoon credits rolling over his quiet breathing. There were mornings she apologized for the way her calendar had eaten another promise. Next time, she'd say, and next time would become later. On Malik's 8th birthday, she left the party early to take a call from a client who couldn't find a file she'd sent twice. The cake waited, candles melting into soft wax puddles. Malik tried to hide his disappointment behind a grin that was too practiced for a child. She noticed the way his eyes followed the door when she left. That night, she stood in the kitchen long after he'd gone to bed, the party hats drooping over the sink, and wondered when providing had started to feel like disappearing. The present pressed in on her as she walked. Her phone buzzed with a message from Malik's teacher. Reminder, awards ceremony today at 4:30 p.m. Malik is very excited you'll be there. Helena stopped on the sidewalk. The city moved around her. Horns, footsteps, snippets of conversations, but the words on her screen held her still. She imagined Malik scanning the crowd of parents, his eyes searching for the face he'd told his friends would be there. She imagined the small, hopeful lift of his shoulders when he saw her. She had already chosen him. The consequence had already been handed down. Fear arrived late, quiet but insistent. The rent, the groceries, the bus pass, the way emergencies stacked up when you couldn't afford them. She exhaled slowly and kept walking. Hours earlier, she had prepared for the moment she'd hoped would never come. She'd opened her calendar and begun moving pieces around like a chessboard. She'd covered 2 late shifts for a coworker who owed her more apologies than favors. She'd front-loaded her reports, triple-checking the numbers until they sang the truth back to her. She drafted a handoff document so detailed it bordered on obsessive. She'd printed her attendance record, 7 years of green checkmarks in a column so long it felt like a small monument. She hadn't prepared for the way Jackson's office would feel when she stood inside it. The glass, the height, the city looking down at her like a ledger of who counted. She hadn't prepared for the moment when her voice would steady on the words, "I'm choosing my son." The moment where courage met risk hadn't felt cinematic. It had felt like a small, stubborn refusal to disappear. By the time Helena reached Malik's school, the sun had softened into gold. Parents clustered near the entrance, laughter and nervous energy weaving through the air. She spotted Malik immediately. He stood a little straighter when he saw her, his grin breaking wide open. "You came," he said, breathless. She knelt and hugged him, the familiar warmth anchoring her. "I told you I'd try." He didn't ask what it cost. Inside the auditorium, she took her seat. The lights dimmed. Names were called. Applause rose and fell like waves. When Malik's name echoed through the room, he walked to the stage with careful steps and accepted his certificate with a seriousness that made her throat tighten. He scanned the audience until his eyes found hers. She lifted her hand. He smiled. For a moment, the world made sense. Later, when the ceremony ended and the crowd spilled into the hallway, Helena's phone buzzed again. Messages from coworkers, half-formed questions, the quiet tremor of a system adjusting to her absence. She silenced it. She looked at Malik, his certificate clutched like a treasure, and thought of all the days she'd missed to keep the lights on. She thought of the word reliable and how it had never once meant seen. "Mom," he said, "are you mad you missed work?" She smiled at him. "No, baby. I'm glad I was here." He nodded, satisfied, and skipped ahead toward the exit. Helena followed, carrying the weight of tomorrow in one hand and the lightness of this moment in the other. Behind her, the office tower cut a hard line against the sky. Ahead of her, The evening opened into something uncertain and real. The hallway outside Jackson Williams's office felt narrower than it should have. Glass walls framed the executive floor like a corridor of judgment, polished, silent, designed to make hesitation visible. Helena stood there with her folder tucked against her ribs, the weight of it more symbolic than physical. Inside were printouts she didn't need anymore. Coverage plans, pre-completed reports, 7 years of attendance distilled into neat, green-checked columns. Proof, she'd thought. Evidence that reliability could earn a single mercy. She steadied her breath. The hum of the building wrapped around her. The muted click of keyboards, the distant whir of printers, the soft footsteps of people moving with purpose. No one looked at her. No one needed to. This floor wasn't built for witnesses. She knocked. "Come in," Jackson's voice said, even and unhurried. The office was spare and immaculate. Clean lines. Cool light. The city pressed against the glass behind him, a grid of windows and motion that made everything feel measurable. Jackson didn't rise from his chair. He didn't gesture for her to sit. "Ms. Brooks," he said, eyes flicking to the folder in her hands. "You asked for time." "Yes, sir." Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I'm requesting one afternoon. I've arranged coverage and completed my deliverables for the week. I'll make up any lost hours." Jackson's gaze moved to the documents she set on his desk. He skimmed the first page with clinical efficiency, then the second. He nodded once, not approval, but recognition. "You have a strong record," he said. "That's not in question." Relief tried to rise. Helena pressed it down. She knew better than to hope too early. "What is in question," he continued, "is the precedent you're asking me to set." "It's one day," she said quietly. "In 7 years." Jackson leaned back in his chair. The leather barely creaked. "We don't reward exceptions," he said. "We reward consistency." "I have been consistent," Helena replied. The words slipped out before she could soften them. She felt the heat of her own honesty and held her ground. "I've never missed a day. I've covered shifts. I've stayed late. I'm not asking to change the system. I'm asking for one afternoon to be present for my child." The word child landed between them like something fragile. Jackson's expression didn't change. "Policy exists for a reason," he said. "If I make allowances for personal events, I undermine the structure that keeps this company functioning. The moment we start bending for stories, we stop operating on standards." Stories, Helena thought, as if Malik's small hands gripping his certificate were a narrative convenience. As if 7 years of yes could be reduced to a deviation. Her mind flashed. Malik's face when he'd practiced his speech in the mirror, shoulders squared with the seriousness of a child trying to be brave. The way he'd asked, "You're coming, right?" The way she'd said, "I'm trying," and meant, "I don't know if the world will let me." She saw the late nights layered over that memory, the blue glow of her phone in the kitchen, the sink full of dishes waiting for a tomorrow she kept postponing. She saw the birthdays she'd slipped into halfway through, the plans she'd canceled with apologies she'd memorized. She heard herself breathe. "I understand policy," Helena said. "I live inside it. She stopped, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm asking you to see me as more than an attendance metric." Jackson turned to his screen. The movement was small, deliberate. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's operational." Operational. The word pressed on her chest. She felt the familiar urge to apologize for needing anything at all. She felt the habit of shrinking tug at her spine. She straightened instead. "Then I won't be here this afternoon," she said. The room seemed to narrow further, the glass drawing in the light. Jackson looked at her fully now. "If you leave," he said, "you're choosing to violate your obligation." "I'm choosing my son." The words were calm. The rage beneath them was quiet, a restrained fire she'd learned to hold so it wouldn't burn everything she touched. Jackson's fingers moved across the keyboard. The click of keys sounded loud in the stillness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hesitate. "Your position will be terminated effective immediately," he said. "Human resources will process your exit. Security will escort you." The sentence landed with the finality of a stamp. For a moment, Helena stood there with the echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought she might cry. She thought she might shout. She did neither. "Thank you for your time," she said, because the words had been trained into her muscles. She turned. The hallway received her with its polished indifference. The hum of work continued. A man laughed somewhere down the corridor. A printer spat out pages. The office didn't pause for endings. As she walked, Helena felt the sting of humiliation rise, being reduced to a line item, erased with a few keystrokes. She kept her pace steady. She kept her head high. She didn't give the glass walls the satisfaction of seeing her falter. In the elevator, her reflection met her gaze. She saw fear there. She saw grief. She also saw something unbent. The doors opened to the lobby. The light changed. The city exhaled. Helena stepped into the daylight unemployed, but unbroken. The gala unfolded like a theater of light. Crystal chandeliers dripped brilliance from ceilings painted with quiet extravagance, each prism catching and scattering gold across the polished marble floors. The air carried the soft perfume of money, floral notes, expensive cologne, the faint bite of champagne. Conversations drifted in controlled laughter, the language of donors and dignitaries folding into itself with practiced ease. Jackson Williams stood at the edge of it all, a glass of amber untouched in his hand. He wore the uniform of belonging, tailored suit, cufflinks that caught the light, a watch that suggested precision without pleading for attention. He had learned long ago how to stand in rooms like this without seeming impressed. Still, the room impressed him. Not with beauty, but with power. The kind of power that moved without noise. This was his mother's world. Margaret Williams hosted these galas the way generals planned campaigns. The guest list was curated with intent. Philanthropists whose donations shaped policy, executives who funded initiatives that would bear Margaret's quiet imprint, politicians who understood the value of proximity. The charity's banner, Workforce Bridges, Ethical Leadership for a Stronger Future, hung behind the stage, its promise dressed in velvet and light. Jackson scanned the room, posture effortless, eyes alert. He wanted to find her. Wanting her approval at 44 felt like a failure of discipline, and yet the want persisted. Margaret's standards were a colder mirror of his own, unyielding, exacting, and rarely satisfied. He had built his company in her image, believing that if he matched her severity with results, he would finally earn something like unspoken praise. He moved through clusters of conversation, nodding, trading brief words. "Jackson," a donor said, clasping his shoulder. "Impressive quarter. Heard your retention metrics are tightening." "We're refining our standards," Jackson replied. "Consistency is the point." "Hard line," the donor smiled. "Your mother would approve." The words landed with more weight than the man intended. Jackson nodded and moved on. He found himself rehearsing what he would say when he saw Margaret. Not explanations, he didn't offer those, but evidence. New initiatives, clean margins, proof of discipline. He straightened his jacket as if that might align him closer to her expectations. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, the way his attention snagged on a table near the center of the ballroom, the way the gold light pooled there more warmly, the way laughter from that corner sounded less transactional and more human. Jackson's eyes traveled and froze. Helena Brooks sat beside Margaret Williams. Not at the periphery, not standing politely behind a chair. Seated, close, engaged in conversation. Helena's posture was relaxed, her smile easy in a way he had never seen in the office corridors. She wore an evening dress that caught the chandelier light softly, her presence unforced, her attention fully on his mother. Margaret leaned toward her, listening. The world narrowed to that single, impossible image. Jackson felt the floor tilt, not enough to unbalance him, but enough to unsettle the certainty he'd carried into the room. His mind raced for explanations that wouldn't fit. A coincidence, a mistake, a catering error, anything that preserved the order he understood. Helena lifted her glass in a small toast. Margaret smiled back. The illusion of control cracked, silent and bright, under the chandeliers. The man who thought he controlled outcomes realizes he doesn't control worth. Jackson didn't move at first. He stood at the edge of the ballroom as if the floor beneath him had turned to glass. Watching the scene, he could not reconcile with the rules of his world. Helena Brooks, hours ago dismissed with a clean signature and a clipped sentence, sat beside Margaret Williams as though she belonged there by right of gravity. The chandeliers crowned them in gold. The laughter at their table was unguarded. The space around them bent with attention. Jackson took a slow breath. The gala noise pressed back in. Strings from the quartet, the low thunder of conversation, the soft clink of glasses. He began to walk, each step measured, each thought attempting to regain its old authority. As he drew closer, he watched Helena more closely than he ever had at work. There was no tension in her shoulders, no careful economy of movement. She leaned forward when she listened. She spoke with her hands, small arcs of emphasis that made people nod. A donor laughed at something she said, then leaned in to hear more. The ease unsettled him more than defiance would have. This wasn't a woman trying to be seen. This was a woman who was seen. Margaret noticed him before Helena did. Her gaze lifted, assessing in the way she always assessed. Quick, exacting, curious only insofar as curiosity produced leverage. "Jackson," she said, her voice carrying without effort. "You've finally decided to circulate." He inclined his head. "Mother." Helena turned. Their eyes met across the small, polished table. The moment stretched, private and public at once. Jackson saw the flicker of recognition in her expression, the brief stillness before composure returned. Helena's face did not harden. It did not soften. It simply acknowledged him and moved on. "Come," Margaret said, gesturing to the empty space at the table. "Sit. You're interrupting a useful conversation." Jackson sat. Up close, the contrast was sharper. Helena's presence didn't shrink beside his mother's. It held. The people at the table, donors, directors, a policy advisor, treated her with the same attention they offered Margaret. Jackson felt the faint pressure of being the only one whose place felt newly uncertain. Margaret turned to Helena. "You were saying," she prompted. Helena nodded. "The mentorship model works because it doesn't treat flexibility as charity," she said. "It treats it as infrastructure. Parents don't need exceptions. They need systems designed with reality in mind. When you build for human variability, performance improves. Attrition drops. Outcomes stabilize." A man in a charcoal tuxedo leaned forward. "You're saying compassion is efficient." Helena smiled slightly. "I'm saying efficiency without compassion is expensive. You pay for it in turnover, burnout, and the quiet loss of people who could have led." Jackson felt the words land inside him like a misfired metric, true in a way his spreadsheets had never captured. Margaret's eyes flicked to him, just once. Then she returned to Helena. "This is precisely why I asked you to consult on workforce bridges," she said. "Your framework is grounded in experience and disciplined by data. Rare combination." "Consult." The word echoed. Jackson's mind raced backward through the day, through the keystrokes that had erased Helena's position, through the certainty that she was replaceable. Margaret gestured toward the banner behind the stage. "Helena's been instrumental in shaping our ethical leadership track," she continued. "Not theory. Implementation. Metrics. Accountability. The sort of rigor you claim to value." The table went quiet for half a breath. Jackson felt heat rise behind his collar. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no language for this reversal that didn't sound like defense. "I didn't know you were involved with the foundation," he said finally, the words thin in his own ears. Helena met his gaze. "You didn't ask," she replied. The simplicity of it cut. Margaret's smile was small and unreadable. "People don't announce their worth, Jackson," she said. "They demonstrate it. It's on the observer to notice." Around them, the gala continued. Laughter, toasts, the low music threading through the room. Jackson sat in the center of his mother's world and felt the perimeter of his own worldview bend. He watched Helena speak about workforce equity programs with the fluency of someone who had lived their failures and designed their solutions. He watched donors nod as she cited retention figures and pilot outcomes. He watched Margaret listen, not indulgently, but with the respect she reserved for minds she trusted. The woman he had dismissed as an operational inconvenience was being validated by the only person whose validation he had ever wanted. Jackson lifted his glass and took a sip he didn't taste. The illusion he'd carried, that outcomes were his to control, that worth could be measured by compliance, fractured under the chandelier light. Jackson waited for a break in the conversation that never came. Helena's voice moved easily around the table, threading insight with experience, numbers with lived consequence. Donors leaned closer. A foundation director scribbled notes on the back of a program. The quartet shifted into a softer register, as if the room itself were listening. He felt the pressure of being unseen in a space he believed was his by inheritance. "Helena," he said at last, the name leaving his mouth with a formality he couldn't soften. "May I have a word?" The table quieted, not abruptly, but with the attentive hush reserved for power deciding to speak. Helena turned to him, her expression composed. She rose without hurry and followed him a few steps away, stopping at the edge of the table where the light from the chandeliers fell clean and unforgiving. "You terminated my position this afternoon," she said, not accusing, not pleading, stating. Jackson felt the words land between them like a line drawn in chalk. "I enforce policy," he replied. "The timing is unfortunate." "Unfortunate is a word that sounds lighter than it feels," Helena said. Her gaze didn't waver. "I asked for one afternoon. I received a conclusion." He searched her face for anger and found only steadiness. The steadiness unsettled him. "This isn't personal," he said again, the phrase thin with repetition. "Standards matter." Helena's lips curved, not in a smile. "Standards are choices," she said. "So is what you decide to see." The space around them tightened. The table had gone quiet enough that the nearby donors pretended not to listen and failed. Margaret stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room shifted toward her with the obedience of gravity. "Jackson," she said, "you're performing your certainty in public." The word struck with surgical precision. Jackson straightened. "I'm defending the integrity of my leadership." Margaret's gaze was level. "Integrity is not rigidity," she said. "And leadership is not the absence of doubt." She turned to the table. For those who were curious about Helena's role, she designed the pilot framework for Workforce Bridge's mentorship track. In 6 months, retention among participating single-parent employees increased by 18%. Absenteeism dropped by 22%. Productivity variance stabilized across 3 divisions. A ripple moved through the listeners. Heads turned. Pens paused. Jackson felt the numbers hit the part of him trained to respect data. They were his language. They were the language he had denied Helena in the office that afternoon. Margaret continued, her tone measured. She proposed flexible coverage protocols that reduced overtime costs by 12% without compromising output. She identified management bottlenecks that were driving quiet attrition, leaders mistaking uniformity for fairness. We implemented her recommendations in 2 partner organizations. The results were not sentimental. They were measurable. Helena stood beside her, the light catching the calm of her posture. The room watched. Jackson's throat tightened. He searched for a counterpoint and found none that didn't sound like defense. "You fired her for requesting one afternoon," Margaret said. "Then you congratulate yourself for standards while dismissing a leader who understands how standards fail the moment they ignore reality." The silence that followed was not cruel. It was attentive, the kind of silence that doesn't punish but reveals. Jackson felt something inside him give way, not dramatically, but with the quiet fracture of a belief losing its authority. He saw the afternoon replayed in his mind, the glass office, the word operational, the ease with which he had reduced a human need to a deviation. He saw now how small that certainty looked under chandelier light. "I enforce consistency," he said, softer now. "You enforce control," Margaret replied. "Wisdom asks what control is for." Helena met his eyes. There was no triumph there, only the boundary she had drawn for herself and the steadiness to keep it. The room resumed its breath in careful increments. Conversations picked up at the edges, the gala's music threading back into place. Jackson stood in the center of his mother's world and felt the exposure settle, not as shame alone, but as clarity. Leadership without humanity, he realized, was just power without wisdom. The gala loosened its grip as the night wore on. Conversations thinned into quieter clusters. Laughter softened. The chandeliers dimmed to a gentler glow, their brilliance no longer sharp but tired with use. The quartet packed away their instruments, the last notes dissolving into the tall ceilings. The theater of power receded, leaving behind pockets of humanity where people spoke more slowly, more honestly. Jackson found Helena near the terrace doors. The city breathed beyond the glass, lights pulsing, traffic threading through the dark like veins of motion. Helena stood with her hands resting lightly on the railing, the cool night air touching her face. She didn't turn when he approached. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of his steps by now. "I'm sorry," Jackson said. The words were simple. He hadn't practiced them. They landed between them without ornament. Helena nodded once, as if acknowledging something she'd already decided to hear. "I know." He swallowed. "I didn't see you." I saw a request and reduced it to risk. I treated your life like a variable I could manage. The admission surprised him with its accuracy. He felt the weight of the day, the glass office, the keystrokes, the chandeliers, settle into a single line of understanding. Helena turned then, her expression open but not soft in a way that invited retreat. You apologized, she said. That matters. He waited for more. She continued, and I forgive you. The word loosened something in his chest he hadn't realized was held tight. Forgiveness felt like permission to breathe. But, Helena said gently, forgiveness isn't the same as returning. The boundary was clear, not sharp, clean. I'm not coming back, she said. Not because I'm angry. Because I've learned what it costs me to work in places where my humanity is treated like a disruption. Jackson nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't offer conditions. The instinct to negotiate rose and fell, unneeded. You deserve better than what I offered, he said. Helena's gaze moved back to the city. I'm building something where I don't have to ask to be seen, she said. Where systems are designed with people in mind, not people designed to fit systems. He thought of the metrics his mother had named. He thought of the frameworks Helena had described. He thought of the quiet way she had stood her ground in his office. I hope you build it, he said. I am, she replied. They stood in the night air, two people no longer bound by a hierarchy that had defined them hours earlier. The gala murmured behind them, a softened echo of a world that still believed proximity to power was the prize. Helena turned to go. Before she stepped away, she met his eyes once more, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with a calm that belonged to someone who had chosen her own center. Redemption, Jackson understood then, did not entitle him to restoration. The gala emptied in waves. Drivers opened doors. Assistants gathered coats. Conversations thinned into polite exits. The chandeliers dimmed again, their light no longer theatrical, just functional. Power dispersed the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, leaving behind a ballroom that looked larger without bodies to fill it. Jackson didn't leave with the others. He stood near the terrace doors long after Helena disappeared into the night. The glass still held the faint warmth of her presence, as if the air remembered her. When he finally turned, the room felt hollowed out. Not empty, hollow. The difference mattered. He found a chair along the wall and sat. The tuxedo felt heavier now, less like armor and more like a costume he didn't know how to take off. He thought of the house he grew up in. Wide hallways, quiet staff, the way doors closed softly so nothing ever sounded like conflict. His childhood had been a series of well-lit rooms and unspoken expectations. Excellence was assumed. Failure was managed. Vulnerability was inefficient. Margaret had raised him with precision. There was love in it, but it was a disciplined love, measured in outcomes, not comfort. Praise arrived as approval for performance. Correction came as guidance on optics. He learned early how to read rooms, how to calibrate his voice, how to make himself impressive without being transparent. He learned how to build systems. Systems kept things predictable. Systems absorbed human mess. Systems meant he didn't have to sit in the discomfort of someone else's life colliding with his expectations. When Helena stood in his office with a carefully prepared request, he hadn't seen a person asking for mercy. He had seen a deviation from a process that made him feel safe. He had called it fairness. Now the word felt thin. He closed his eyes and replayed the scene. The stillness of her voice, the steadiness of her posture, the way she had chosen her son without raising her volume. He had mistaken composure for compliance. He had mistaken policy for principle. What had he been protecting? Not the company. The metrics had survived her absence just fine. Not order. The office had returned to its rhythm without him lifting a finger. What he had protected was the distance that kept him from being changed by anyone else's need. He stood and walked the perimeter of the room. The carpet muted his steps. He noticed how everything here was designed to absorb impact, sound, emotion, friction. Even the architecture discouraged echoes. He had built his leadership the same way. Reduce noise. Eliminate variance. Keep the edges smooth enough that nothing cut into him. But leadership without edges didn't shape anything. It only dulled it. He thought of the reports he prized, turnover rates, efficiency curves, time-to-output ratios. They had always felt clean, honest. They didn't show birthdays missed. They didn't register canceled plans or the quiet arithmetic of single parenthood. They measured what was easy to count and ignored what was costly to carry. He had liked that about them. Who was he without those measures? The question unsettled him. His identity had been scaffolded by standards: exceed benchmarks, avoid exceptions, reward compliance. He had been praised for consistency his whole life. The idea that consistency could be a hiding place unsettled him more than any failure ever had. He stopped by the windows and looked out at the city. The lights below were uneven, alive with small, uncoordinated movements. No system held them together. They persisted anyway. Growth, he realized, did not arrive as an upgrade to the same framework. It arrived when the framework cracked, when pride broke just enough to let in something unmeasured. He took off his jacket and draped it over the chair. The room felt colder without it. He didn't put it back on. For the first time in a long while, Jackson let the discomfort stay. The weeks after the gala did not arrive with thunder. They came quietly, through meetings that felt different, through pauses Jackson had never allowed himself before, through decisions that took longer because he let other voices finish their sentences. Change did not announce itself. It made room. On Monday mornings, Jackson began sitting in on departmental stand-ups without speaking first. He listened to how managers summarized pressure as performance, how urgency became shorthand for urgency, without care. He noticed the language he had taught them: efficient, neutral, bloodless. Words that turned people into functions. He let the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to surface. In that space, something truer often followed. He asked HR to bring him data he had never requested before. Not just attrition curves and productivity deltas, but exit interviews. Not just time to output, but reasons people burned out. He read the narratives late at night, the unpolished sentences where people tried to be grateful while naming the harm. It felt like learning a new dialect of the same workplace he thought he knew fluently. He revised the policies he had once defended as neutral. Flexible leave that trusted managers to judge context. Coverage plans that didn't punish the person who needed help. Mentorship programs that paired performance metrics with ethical accountability. Leaders evaluated not only on outcomes, but on how many people under them grew without breaking. The board raised eyebrows. He showed them projections. The numbers still mattered. They always would. But this time, the models included retention that assumed dignity had value. He stopped calling it softness. He called it sustainability. The office changed in ways that were hard to chart, but easy to feel. Managers learned to ask one more question. Employees learned that emergencies were not moral failures. The machine still ran. It simply ran with fewer people ground into it. Some days, Jackson wondered if this was penance disguised as reform. Other days, it felt like alignment at last. His standards no longer arranged to protect his distance, but to guard against his blindness. Helena's name surfaced in his mind less often now, which he took as a sign of respect. She was no longer a mirror for his failure. She was a person with her own expanding horizon. He learned through Margaret's updates that Helena's program had scaled. The Workforce Equity Initiative was piloted in 3 cities, then 5. Mentorship models tied to measurable promotion rates. Training cohorts that included childcare stipends and schedule elasticity. The metrics were solid. The outcomes held. The people stayed. One afternoon, months later, their paths crossed without ceremony. Jackson was leaving a building where a public-private partnership had just been signed. The sidewalk hummed with midday traffic, the ordinary orchestra of a city doing what cities do. Helena stood across the street, speaking with a program director. She looked unhurried, rooted, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself to be felt. They saw each other at the same time. There was no flinch this time, no power in the pause, just recognition. They crossed the distance and stopped a respectful arm's length apart. The air between them held no debt. Whatever had been owed had already been paid in silence and boundary. Looks like the work is growing, Jackson said, nodding toward the building behind her. It is, Helena replied. The people are. He smiled, the kind that doesn't perform for approval. I'm glad. She studied him, not to measure remorse, but to register the absence of it. The absence of defensiveness. So am I. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. It had done its work and released them both. There was no bitterness to resolve, no access to negotiate. Just mutual respect, clean, unencumbered. As they parted, Jackson felt the strange relief of not trying to correct a story that was no longer his to manage. He walked back to his car with a lighter step. The city felt less like a system to control and more like a field of lives to consider. He knew the reforms he'd started would outlast him only if others carried them forward. Standards, he had learned, were not just rules you enforced. They were the shape of the room you made for people to become more than their outputs. He paused before opening the door, the thoughts settling with a clarity that felt earned, not gifted. Leadership that forgets people forgets its purpose. He fired her to protect his standards, then learned his standards were protecting his blindness.